We're joined today by Marc Stier, Director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. As the legislature is scheduled to return to session today, you expressed concern over Senate Bill 327. Can you explain what the concerning amendment would do and why you voiced opposition to it?
Sure. What the amendment would do would be require the governor to issue certain rules about when businesses could reopen. The presumption of the amendment is that there are rules provided by the federal government that say how and businesses can mitigate the impact of the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 on the transmission of that virus. And they're saying the governor should issue rules that tell businesses what they should do, and then businesses that say they're going to follow those rules should reopen. There are a couple of problems. Number one, there actually are no such rules being provided by the federal government. If you look at the documents that the amendment itself mentions, the rules they're saying is that when you have very heavy transmission of the disease through the community, as we do now, people should stay home. People should telecommute to work. There's just no safe way to conduct business where people have some physical contact with one another, or where they're trading materials, whether it's food on plates or construction materials or papers or receipts or products, those sorts of things. There's just no safe way to do it. The second problem is there's no enforcement provision in this amendment. Businesses will be able to say, yeah, we're meeting these non-existent rules or these fake rules, and then reopen. No one's going to check on them. No one's going to make sure that they have a plan in place, that they're following the plan. No one's going to ensure that the employees are safe. If employees object and say they don't want to work under safe conditions, there's no way to protect those employees. If they're fired because they don't want to work, there's no guarantee they'll get unemployment insurance. So this is really not a way to protect employees and the customers of those businesses. And the third problem is this really isn't just an issue for individual businesses or for the customers of those businesses. It's an issue for all of us. If we see greater transmission of the COVID-19 virus and businesses reopening over all the state, that will spread wildly through the community, as was happening a few weeks ago before we had the shutdowns. And the consequences could be disastrous, much more illness and much more death. And we think Pennsylvania ought to be doing what every other sensible state in the country is doing and just waiting this out. We understand the concerns of businesses and their employers who are losing business, who are losing work, who are losing wages, who are losing profits. We've called for a number of measures that the federal and state government could take to protect them. Some of those measures have been put in place. We're advocating for others. But that's the way to help people, to wait this virus out, compensate people for their losses, and then restart the economy as quickly as we can.
What do you foresee as the long-term economic impact that the Commonwealth will experience once this pandemic is passed?
It's going to be a very serious impact, at least in the short term. In the long term, I actually think we could recover relatively quickly if the right economic policies are put in place, particularly at the federal level, but also at the state level. The key thing is to support individuals and businesses who are hurting now, provide funds so that they can continue their lives, and so that once people can go back to work, people return to their normal buying patterns. You know, we're fighting a war, essentially, and during wartime, countries borrow. We're not anywhere near what we've borrowed to fight World War II. We're not anywhere near what Britain borrowed to fight the French in the late 19th and in the early 19th century. We're just going to have to, sustain people now, sustain state spending, and then if we do that, we think the economy will recover, particularly if you can avoid a second or third wave of closings later in 2020. But the short-term problem is going to be serious. The state budget is going to take a tremendous hit, and we need to figure out ways to compensate for that.
Do you think that certain demographics or certain economic classes will be more affected by this pandemic?
There's no question that what this pandemic is showing is the fissures in our social safety net. It's showing that people who have low incomes, people who are Black and brown, people who are disabled and handicapped, people who are older are suffering much more. Even if you look at something like who's on the front lines, we're seeing much higher rates in other places. We don't have data from Pennsylvania yet about uh, people of color suffering from COVID-19 more than white people, at least higher rates than white people. And that's because they are doing many of the emergency jobs, necessary jobs that have to be done right now. I hope we come out of this with a new appreciation that we're all in this together, and that to protect ourselves from not only this big disaster, but the contingencies of every life, of sickness, of unemployment, of divorce, uh, of losing a parent. We need to strengthen our social safety net and make sure that everyone can be sustained in getting health care and housing and have food security under difficult conditions.
You've called for a wartime equality response to COVID-19. What does that mean exactly?
Well, during war, we want everyone in the country to bear the burdens of that war equally. During World War II, there were a lot of restrictions on our economy, but there also were very, very high taxes on rich people, so that funds were available not just to fight the war, but to enable everyone in the country to do well, so that the sacrifices required by wartime didn't fall primarily on those with low incomes. And that's what we're calling for right now. We need to ensure that in this time of shared sacrifice, that people with low incomes, people who do jobs that require them to be out in public, in a construction site or in a retail operation, are protected. And those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work at home, pay a little bit more in taxes if we have to sustain them.
Are there recovery lessons that we can learn from past recessions?
Yes, I think the biggest lesson is don't be afraid to be bold. In the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, we had a $1 trillion stimulus package, and it ran out in 2 years as the economy was starting to recover, and then we stopped. President Obama wanted additional spending. Republicans turned him down, and the consequences were very serious for the country as a whole. We grew out of that recession very slowly. And in Pennsylvania, when the recovery funds from the federal government ran out, we saw drastic cutbacks in education, K-12 education, higher education, in human services, in environmental protection. And the state is still suffering the consequences of those cutbacks. We saw a long period of very slow growth in the state, in employment and economic growth, because of those cutbacks. And I'm afraid we could do the same thing if we're not willing to spend what it takes at the federal level and at the state level to sustain our economic life during the crisis.
As lawmakers begin to consider the next state budget, they may be forced to look at potentially spending cuts or increasing taxes. Can you talk briefly about the benefits and the drawbacks of each of those options?
Well, the drawbacks of spending cuts, I've already kind of alluded to. There are not all that many areas where the state has a lot of discretion in what it spends. It has to spend on the Medicaid program, for example, because it's required by federal law. The big cuts would come in K-12 education, in higher education, in human services, environmental protection, the things we cut during the Great Recession. And as I said, those cuts were disastrous, both in terms of their impact on the state's economy, but also long-term in terms of the health of people, because our air and water are substantially dirtier than that of other states, because our roads and bridges are in much worse state of repair, because the rate of people 25 and older who have a college education is down at the bottom among the other states, because we have one of the highest rates of student debt in the country. All those things, in some ways, are a product of the cuts of 2010, 2011. This time, rather than make those cuts, first of all, we have to get as much money as we can from the federal government. But second of all, if we have to raise taxes on the very rich Pennsylvanians who despite stock market crashes and other issues, are still doing very well, we should do that. We have one of the most unequal tax systems in the whole country. People in the bottom 20% of incomes and in the middle 20% of incomes pay about half the tax rate of the top 1%. If we just had an equal tax system, everyone paying the same rate, we could reduce taxes on working people, raise taxes on the rich, bring in more money, and sustain ourselves in a serious time like this.
One last question. When the governor initially proposed his budget in February, you were supporting his calls for increasing the minimum wage, creating a severance tax on natural gas drilling, etc. At this current moment in history, do you think that lawmakers should reconsider what priorities are in the upcoming budget?
I'll be honest, I think the key priority is sustaining what we have, is finding the revenues to enact a budget along the lines governor will propose. We still think it makes sense to raise the minimum wage. That will help our economy. In fact, it would be a big boon for our economy if we could raise the minimum wage as we're reopening businesses. It would put more money in the hands of people who spend it. And that's how you drive an economy forward, by giving people the resources to take care of themselves, to buy things from local stores and from local businesses. And that ripples through the economy and creates the kind of economic growth we want to see.
We are out of time. Marc Stier is the director of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me on.
Award-winning historian Brady Kreitzer takes you on a journey through 300 years of conflict in Battlefield, Pennsylvania, a guide to the Keystone State's most sacred ground. The book, based off of PCN's original program Battlefield, Pennsylvania, explores 29 of the state's most significant battlegrounds. Discover the history in our backyard. Order your copy today by calling the number on your screen.
We're joined today by Senator Pat Browne, chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senator, now that taxes are not due until July, how will that change how you plan the state budget?
Well, we're in uncharted territory, obviously. The amount of resources that will be moved in July is estimated in the $3 billion range. But it's really just a timing difference in terms of when we expect the money to come in, to 2 weeks to a month beyond the fiscal cycle. We will just have to change our basic accounting, the way we account for these dollars, in order to, across 2 cycles, in order to accommodate the process. The bottom line is we're expecting the tax payments that have been deferred for the right reasons to come in, and we will develop a process to accommodate that. We just have to be flexible at this point in time. The main challenge we have is the downturn of receipts that's in line with the current circumstance in the economy. And our receipts are driven by economic activity. We expect April to be a very challenging month. The fiscal deficit, notwithstanding that timing difference, will be, we believe, in excess of $1 billion, and that might be conservative. We'll have to, again, uncharted territory, and it's very difficult to estimate revenue capacity unless things are similar to historic trends, and obviously this is not. So we'll just have to make sure that when we advance the budget, it accommodates these current challenges.
Have you had discussions with your colleagues yet about the potential for cuts or perhaps shifting budget priorities?
No, not at this point in time. We really have to have a sense of what's probable at this time. All budgeting policy is based on probability. You can't advance a budget document unless you understand what is probable in your revenue capacity. And until we have a sense of that, we cannot really come to any real determinations on any revenue discussions or expense conversations. What we are wrestling with is how the federal stimulus package works into this, and that's a $7.8 billion number. Some of it allocated amongst different programs that that are key to our priorities here. Education is a big one, but there's a $4.9 billion number that's for general state support, and we'll have to decide how to best integrate that into our budget process.
The governor last month called for the closure of all non-life sustaining businesses. Keeping that in mind, how do you expect that will impact the state's bottom line as you plan the budget?
It impacted significantly. Most of our revenue capacity is built off of two things. It's built off of personal income tax, mostly through withholdings on wages, and sales tax payments, both of which will be enormously affected by the actions that we've needed to take in order to protect our health and safety. That's key, and that's the most important thing that we need to do right now. Our budgeting in state government is going to be secondary to that, but obviously it's going to be affected through April. We'll have to see the cycle of the virus in terms of infection and mitigation and how long this lasts. But every day that a significant part of our economy is not producing, it has dramatic effects on our revenue capacity and what we have available to us to spend on important initiatives that are important to state government and to the citizens of Pennsylvania. So it's very unusual times. We were fearing that a eventual recession would affect our finances. I talked about that a lot during our appropriations process. We didn't believe it would be affected 2 weeks after that by something like this. So in the end, we just have to work on a bipartisan basis with the governor to make sure we address these challenges.
You're among a group of senators that sent a letter to the governor calling for expediting opening some businesses. What exactly would you do differently than what's being done right now to get Pennsylvania working again?
The only thing I would, personally, I think, and I think our caucus believes this, the governor's doing what he believes is the best approach in order to protect the health and safety of the citizens. The more that can be done to provide some probability and predictability to the citizens in terms of a timeline. There's been, Washington has done this, other states have done this. I saw there was a press conference this morning with the governor of New York, and they obviously are in a lot worse situation than us, trying to at least try to give citizens some certainty as to the, if possible, as to the timeline of this. So businesses are built off of certainty. Having certainty in the marketplace. So that is, I think, the thing that we would like to see in short order. The governor try to provide more certainty as to a timeline. They're stating that they're using modeling out of the University of Pittsburgh, but not providing any details there. So that's the kind of balance I think we're calling for.
What kind of resources are available for Pennsylvanians that are either out of work or have their business shuttered at this time?
Pretty significant expansion of unemployment benefits. The federal stimulus package had an additional $600 a month that citizens can depend on following with unemployment. I know there's going to be challenges with the systems trying to accommodate all the need, but I know that the Department of Labor is doing everything they can to adjust their systems accordingly. There's also very significant support in the federal stimulus package for business to support payroll at this time. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program that will pretty much pay a business's payroll for 8 weeks after they file the application. It's a $363 billion program. We expect a lot of demand for that, but it's probably the most, in terms of responding to a disaster, the most significant program that's ever come out of Washington or any government to help businesses sustain their operations during a difficult time. And I highly recommend that any business out there, small or up to 500 employees, look at that program to help keep people working.
Are there lessons that you can take from either past budget shortfalls or perhaps from the most recent recession that you can apply to this year's budget planning?
Yeah, I think that probably the most appropriate circumstance, at least in terms of historical performance, would be the experience that we had after 9/11. A traumatic shock to the economy, very rapid, unfortunate shock to the economy, and the economy recovering over a shorter period of time than the last one that was based mostly on economic fundamentals. That I think is probably a better benchmark than the last 10 years we've had that was more fundamental, the challenges in the economy more fundamental than just one single incident. I think a lot of the revenue estimating will be based on the current circumstance plus reflecting on that history, and hopefully it recovers as quickly because that recovery was a lot quicker than the last one.
The Senate is scheduled to return to session today. What will you work on this week?
We are moving together continue to prioritize COVID-19 relief initiatives. One is to give citizens an extension on at the discretion of local communities, the payment of property taxes, to eliminate penalties, to allow them to pay their obligations to local governments in an extended timeline. Through our committee, we're going to be advancing a lot of the budget bills that we advance every year, so the general fund and other funds, so we can start that process along.
Our guest has been Senator Pat Browne, Chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Take care.
For over 40 years, PCN has delivered quality educational and informational resources to viewers. PCN has expanded its programming over the past 25 years with politics and policy, history and culture, and sports, thanks to the vision of Brian Lockman. PCN has kept pace with technology and how viewers can watch. Whether on cable, online, or on the go, Brian has perpetually moved the network forward. PCN congratulates Brian Lockman on his 25 years of service and his well-deserved retirement. Thank you, Brian.
We're joined today by Terry Madonna, Director for the Center for Politics and Public Affairs at Franklin and Marshall College. Dr. Madonna, the Pennsylvania primary election has been delayed to June 2nd now as a result of the pandemic. What effect will that have at the polls?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't know that anyone knows for sure. I mean, obviously having it on April 28th would have been a very serious healthcare risk for Pennsylvanians, and I think the legislature was wise to move it to June 2nd. There's 7 or 8 other states, by the way, that also will hold their primaries on June 2nd. And here's what's really critical about it. On June 2nd, and remember, the presidential campaign is virtually at a standstill. On the Democratic side for the nomination, obviously Bernie Sanders trails former Vice President Joe Biden by something like 303 delegate votes. So what's likely to happen, Francine, on June 2nd is simple. It looks like Joe Biden will secure the necessary majority of the delegates so that when the convention meets now, the Democratic convention meets in August, he will have the nomination wrapped up. The magic number is 1991, and he has a 303 vote lead right now, delegate vote lead over Bernie Sanders, and there's no nomination campaign going on. Obviously, everything is virtual. People are focused on the virus and it spread, the COVID-19 virus and how it is spreading. So literally campaigning, I don't care if we're talking about state House, state Senate seats in Pennsylvania or congressional races. The bottom line is simple. There is literally no campaign except a little bit going on virtually.
Will Pennsylvania still have any relevance in the presidential race?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. When we get to the fall, when we get to November 3, and there's conversation about whether that date will hold up, but when we get to November 3, here's the story. Pennsylvania, and I'm going to throw in Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, and then let's add North Carolina and Arizona, are without doubt the critical states likely to determine the next president of the United States. Not only is Pennsylvania one of the key battleground states, but some analysts think we are the key. In other words, we are the single most important state. I'm not there yet. I think we got Michigan, Wisconsin, as I said, Florida. They're probably the big 4. We can throw in a couple more like Arizona and North Carolina. And we're likely, if there's any campaigning going to happen in the fall, we're going to be one of the most visited states by the presidential candidates in the country. I don't think at this, we'll certainly be in the top 2 or 3. Whether they're number 1 or not remains to be seen.
On what factors do you think Pennsylvanians will judge the leadership of both the president as well as the governor regarding the pandemic?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, let's face it, there are two right now situations that are likely to be paramount. One would be the coronavirus. I mean, all the judgments being made by the folks on the task force, the president's task force, and other experts are this could go on to June, July, and even into August. So the coronavirus is going to be a factor. How it was handled, debates over what can be done in the future. But maybe the most pressing argument will be the economy. If you go back through history, the economy, now there have been big exceptions to it. We obviously had an election during the Civil War. We had elections during World War II. You get the point, and the Great Depression as well. But the biggest factor historically has been the economy, the economy, the economy. Jimmy Carter lost his re-election bid in 1980 to Ronald Reagan because we were in recession. Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992 over George Herbert Walker Bush because of the recession. And one of the reasons that Barack Obama won the presidency in 2008 because we were in the midst of the Great Recession, and George W. Bush, the Republican, was president of the United States, serving out his second term. So I don't think there's any doubt that the economy is going to dominate the electoral landscape. Now, make no mistake about it, we don't know if we'll be in a foreign policy crisis. We don't know. There are other things that could crop into the debate over what matters on November 3 of this year. That's the date when we pick the electors. We call it Presidential Election Day. There's no doubt about that. But the economy, the economy, the economy.
Well, in addition to the economy, does the pandemic change any other issues that may not have been a priority to voters prior to March or April?
That's another great question. Sure. There's going to be a debate over universal health care. There's going to be a debate over Medicare for all. Now, Bernie Sanders is not going to be likely the nominee of the party, but his position on that single payer, we're going to have to see how that works out. Now, the position right now is if you go to the hospital with a coronavirus problem, you're not going to pay the bill. But the fact of the matter is, I think, and in the polls that were done in 2018 in the midterm and the polls that are done right now, healthcare dominates what voters care about. So healthcare could, be right up in there with the economy in terms of its significance on November 3rd, and I should say throughout the presidential campaign.
Has the pandemic affected your ability to collect data and conduct polls?
Well, yeah, I mean, we at Franklin and Marshall, we postponed the poll in March. We'll have largely because we didn't want to get folks together in a room. You can understand that, and do the calls. The college, as many other colleges did, virtually shut down unless you were, performing what Governor Wolf would call an essential, had an essential position. You were to work from home. But it is possible now, and the technology's there, to allow the interviewers to do the calls from their respective homes. And there's a program that Burwood Yost and the Center for Opinion Research folks are working out to be able to do that. So but we'll be able to do polls moving forward, even if we remain stay at home, if the executive order for stay at home remains in place.
Does it affect voter behavior if there is a lack of polls influencing a perceived leader?
I don't know about polls, but here's the problem. Right now, campaigning is virtual. And as you know from covering politics over the years, a lot of races, particularly when you get the state house and state senate races, maybe state house even more than state senate, but I'll throw congressional races. It's called knock on the proverbial door, do door to door. But you also have events in which you have gatherings. Sometimes, hundreds of people show up for these rallies and these meetings. That's all off the table right now. Nothing. So I don't know how long that's likely to last. Nobody does until this all works its way through. So much will depend on whether or not there's a lot of audience participation and campaigns that can be taken directly to the people in person, not just virtual, meaning over the internet and using Zoom and Skype and other forms that will be helpful. Other ways to communicate with people. So if we have direct campaigning, if the limits on crowd size, if crowd appearances, crowd sizes, if they all go away, then I think we'll get back to more traditional campaigning.
Looking specifically in Pennsylvania, how is Governor Wolf being judged in terms of how is he being perceived for his leadership on the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, that's also another very fine question. And right now, in the several polls that have been done, he ranks high. There have been polls of governors in general, and they're ranking pretty high. I think Governor Wolf has been very aggressive in what he has done. He has been, I won't use the term outspoken, but he and Secretary of Health, Levine, have made regular appearances explaining what's going on. He was very, very aggressive. The only difficulty I think he had when it came, and I'm going to bring my notes up and make sure I got this correct, when he closed businesses who were not, and the word that was used was life-sustaining. There have been 34,000 appeals to closing businesses that weren't considered life-sustaining. 5,600 of them approved, 8,100 denied. I wanted to check make sure I got the numbers correctly. And the criticism that came in large part from the business community was there was no consultation. The governor and his staff just went ahead and did this. And there have been this appeal process, I think, which actually ends today. And that appeals process has been very, very important. But that's been pretty much the only what I'd call major criticism. And there's been a bill introduced into the legislature by Speaker Mike Turzai in the House that would put construction, certain construction projects back on the table, mainly for I'm reading again, public and private construction will be continued. So overall, you get the point. But he's been ahead of the curve. He's been one of the national leaders in terms of protecting his citizens.
One last question before I let you go. What are your predictions on what you think can get accomplished in state government this year, particularly regarding the state budget?
Well, it looks like the budget deficit is going to be a substantial one. We don't know. There have been estimates made. I've seen them at $4 billion. We're going to have to wait and find out. And income taxes don't have to be submitted now until July 15. But make no mistake about it, we're going to have a serious budget problem that the legislature and the governor are going to have to address. And it wouldn't surprise me, since you can't collect the taxes, or people don't have to pay the state taxes until July 15th, that it's not settled by June 30. But the bottom line here is there is a very, very significant budget problem, which the state is going to have to address in some way, and taxing the voters of the state with new taxes is not going to be very popular. And given the fact that we have so many people out of work, it looks like they may have to go through the budget and cut a good many programs that normally wouldn't be cut out of next year's fiscal budget.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. We've been joined by Terry Madonna, Director for the Center of Politics and Public Affairs at Franklin and Marshall College. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.